to my channel. In today's video, we are going to learn how to make a die cut card, specifically a die cut floral bouquet, if you don't have a lot of colored cardstock. Today we are going to use our artist markers or alcohol markers in order to color in our images, but you can use whatever you've got. I have a selection of artist markers here, and I will write down their names in the description box below the video, just so if you want to use these specific colors or adapt your color palette however you choose, you can do that based off of the correct colors used. I am using Concord and Ninth Ballet slippers, those artist markers you saw, and the star of the show is this watercolor garden layering die set from Altenew. I don't know if they are still doing this, but for a time, they were doing it to where their layering dies, all of the same color was on the same die. You had multiple flowers or multiple elements on the same die, but all of the same color was on the same die. And so that is how this particular die set works. So not all of the flowers have all of the colors. And that's something that we'll kind of talk a little bit more about later on. So we are also using this Momenta stamp Ornate Love stamp set. Sorry, that's our little chime. And then I have this piece of white cardstock that I had embossed using an embossing folder for my stash. I believe this is from Momenta from Hobby Lobby, but I looked at the embossing folder and it doesn't have its name on there, and I don't have the packaging any longer, but I believe it is from Momenta. I did cut that panel down to about 3 3/4 by 5.5, just because I'm going to have some colored cardstock kind of peeking out of the side. So this is what I'm talking about. There are multiple elements or multiple florals on each die, but that die cuts out the same layer. So this one cuts out like the medium layer. The lightest layer, all of the greenery, none of this greenery layers. It's all just a single, a single image. Sorry. So I'm just pointing out that there are 6 dies in this set, and that will give you, I believe, 5 different florals. And I went ahead and kind of mapped some things out. So the lightest die, so for the lightest color of cardstock, I went ahead and colored out that, and I just used a pen to kind of map out where this was all going to go. And then in the top corner, I wrote, this is the greenery. I put a G. This is the lightest layer. I put an L. This is the medium layer. I put an M. And I just kind of mapped that out, and then I scribbled my marker over it. I was not particular about getting a super awesome blend. For the greenery, I just went from lightest to darkest, and then that top section, I didn't map things out perfect, and so I ended up doing one of the medium colors at the very top, just so that the greenery would have some variation. For the actual florals, all I'm doing is what you see here, and that's all I did for all of these layers, is I literally scribbled left to right, and I scribbled up and down. And I did that just to try to get rid of some of those ink marker lines, but I wasn't being super careful. I wasn't trying to make sure that I had no lines at all. A little bit of texture was fine by me. A little bit of variation, I guess I should say, was fine by me. So I am going to do this for every single one of these dies. I've already kind of mapped everything out, and I'm just literally going through and trying to get a somewhat cohesive color, but I'm not being super particular. And I will occasionally bring back in the die just to make sure that I have enough of the area colored in. And I'm going to do that for every single one of these dies. So I'm not going to bore you with all of that, but that is how I did that. And this is one way that you can get multiple colors for something if you do not have lots of colored cardstock. I know some crafters, they don't really have a big stash of colored cardstock. Others do. I have a okay stash of colored cardstock, but my quality is, it's like a 65 pounds, so it's not very heavyweight. It would work well for something like this today. But as far as like a card base or something that needed to be a little more sturdy, that doesn't really work very well. I used artist markers to color this, but you could absolutely use colored cardstock. You could use backgrounds that you've made. You could use patterned paper. You could use vellum. I mean, you could use alcohol inked cardstock that you've made. Sky's the limit. I did go through and just cut each of these pieces apart, each of these colored sections apart, so that I could die cut them out. I was showing you there that there are some stems for kind of those smaller florals that you could use to give your flowers some actual, like, if you weren't going to put them in a bouquet necessarily, but you were just going to have them be individual. All Altenew packaging comes with a layering guide. If you are dumb like me and when you first got these, you threw away that packaging, you can always go to their website and find the packaging again. That is something that they always have on their website to make it easy. And sometimes you can find videos where crafters have actually layered them. I'm a visual learner, and so it's very helpful for me to watch a video. I just learn a lot faster that way. So I am just, these layer up pretty easy. And because this is a watercolor floral, it's pretty forgiving. And so if you don't get it exactly right, don't worry about it. Just use it to get it in the ballpark. So what I do in order to get these to layer a lot easier is I try to put the layer in the orientation that it is on that layering guide. That helps me a lot as far as getting these layers to line up a lot easier, is trying to get them oriented how they are on that layering guide. And then some of these layers, they have sections that follow the outer or the bottom layer really close. And so I try to use those to help me, just trying to find like certain points that are very distinctive to help me line up my layers. I'm just using some reptile glue in this Barely Arts fine tipped glue bottle to layer up these layers. I did color these on some scrap cardstock. I was printing out a calendar and that page didn't print well. It didn't print right, and so I just flipped it over and used the back side of the cardstock for these flowers. So just kind of using up some scraps that I had. That's what I'm showing you right here is I use like distinctive markers on the image in order to help me line things up easier. The floral centers, because they are so teeny tiny, I didn't really follow the guide for those. I just kind of placed them where I thought they looked nice or in the orientation that they kind of fell. Those parts are pretty forgiving, like I said, because they are so teeny tiny. So I'm just going to finish up getting all of these glued together, and then we will move on to the next step. I went through my colored cardstock scraps and chose a color that I thought looked good with all of these images. I cut that down to 5.5 by 4 1/4 and glued that flat to my side folding card base. Here, this is the 5.5 by 3 3/4 inch dry embossing folder embossed panel. And I'm going to glue that in the middle so that I've got an even border on the left and the right of this. I do end up having to trim off a little bit off the top just because I didn't cut my card bases exactly right. And so there was a little bit of this hanging off the top, and I'm just going to use my scissors and trim that off. For the sentiment, I pulled a stamp from the Simon Says Stamp Ornate Love. It says a crazy little thing called. And then I'm going to stamp that onto just a scrap piece of white cardstock in this poppy ink from Concord and Ninth. I showed you ballet slippers in the beginning. I end up using that on the inside of the card, but as far as this outside sentiment goes, I needed something that stood out a little bit more. And so I chose this poppy ink from Concord and Ninth. I am going to end up having to die cut this out, and I used just a coordinating banner die from my stash. I believe that is from Simon Says Stamp, but I don't recall exactly where I purchased that from. So I'm just going to trim this down using that banner shaped die that has some faux stitching on the outside. And I'm going to cut that out with my little Sizzix sidekick here and get that glued to the bottom of the card. If I would have been thinking, I would have stamped that out on that white panel, but because that white embossed panel has so much texture, this would not have stamped correctly. And so I had to kind of adapt and use a die cut to get my sentiment on the front of the card. So I went and arranged all of my images, how I wanted them to appear on the card. And here I have another piece of that press and seal. I've shown this little trick in previous videos. You take the sticky side of the press and seal and you push it down onto your arrangement how you want it. And then you're able to pick everything up and flip it over and glue everything down in one fell swoop. You don't have to go piece by piece. You don't have to worry about shifting things around. You're just able to apply your glue and then flip everything back over and stick it down to your card in one fell swoop. I chose not to put any foam tape behind any of these images here, just because these dies are pretty hefty once you get them all layered together, and I didn't feel the need to add any more dimension to this card as far as like foam tape. I am going to pop up the sentiment on some foam tape. This is instant dimension foam tape from Altenew, but that is the only thing that has any like dimension to it, to this card. So I'm just going to try to give this glue a second to adhere, and then I will go through and on any of these parts that are not adhered down well, I'll just kind of lift up the corner of each of those images and apply just a little bit more glue just so that I can get everything adhered well. I did adhere that sentiment down with that instant dimension foam tape and went ahead and put that on the bottom. I felt like this card needed some sparkle and some shine. I felt like it was just kind of missing something, and so I have a Spectrum Noir crystal clear glitter brush pen here. This is not going to move any of your ink around. If you were using a water-based ink, it would, but because this is an alcohol ink, it doesn't move any of the ink around. And I'm just adding some shimmer, some clear shimmer to all of the flowers. You could have added shimmer just to the centers. You could have added it all to all of the things. You could have used a shimmer spray. Totally up to you. I just chose to add some sparkle and shine to these florals. It is extremely difficult to see on the video. In fact, you can't see it at all. You can see it in some of the photos at the end. There is just a little bit of shine to them, but not a whole lot. So I wanted to have this love on the inside of the card, but I wasn't thinking, and so I had already adhered all of these florals to the outside of this card. And when I went to stamp it down, it doesn't really fit. And so in order to help that, and in order to make sure I don't like crease the finished card base, I just took a 5.5 by 4.25 inch sheet of white cardstock. I'm going to stamp this love sentiment so that our card reads a crazy little thing called love. And I'm going to stamp that in that Ballet Slippers ink from Concord and Ninth. I chose a very, very light ink so that if you needed to write over the sentiment, you very well could, and it would still be legible but not distract. You could still write over it and still read what you were writing to your recipient. I end up cutting this down a little bit to where it's 4.25 by 5.5, just so that it's not just so I could get it centered a little bit better. And then I will glue that flat to the inside of the card. So the overall sentiment will say, "Oh, crazy little thing called love." I still felt like this card was missing something, so I have some glossy accents in a fine tip bottle here, and I am going to add just some glossy accents, which is kind of like a clear enamel, to the very centers of these flowers. I'm not adding it all over the flowers. I'm not adding it anywhere else, just to the centers, and that will give it some shine. And then there's the sparkle from the glitter brush pen. It'll give it some shine and it'll give it some dimension. I did have a little bit of bubbles in this one particular flower center, and so I just took a needle, like a pin, and popped all of those. It's very easy to do. It doesn't hurt anything. This also does not move the color around, and so if that's not something that you need to worry about with this particular card. And then this card is all done. So I appreciate you watching. I appreciate you spending some time with me today. I hope you felt inspired. I hope you liked this video. And until next time, I hope you have a wonderful day.